Ladies and gentlemen, can I just assure you that your conversation is music to my ears, because it means you're all having a good yarn about something that's important. So thank you very much. However, even more important, can I now introduce Stephanie from Bond? For those of you who don't know, Bond is a grouping similar to the MCG, but for the, and now I've gone completely blank, International Development Agencies. And they have been running a bit longer than we have, and obviously have a track record, and there's lots we could perhaps listen to and learn from. So without more ado, Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you, Graham. Great to be here. I was last in Trinity House when I was the chair of the Sustainable Shipping Initiative, and we signed our first vision for sustainable shipping in the room next door, and I think we actually stood on this podium and had the photos. And I was saying to Vicky, there was some consternation about whether or not we could have red wine because of the carpet. But it all went very well, and so it's very nice to be back. So you may be wondering, what am I doing here? I run an organisation focused on international development. You're all maritime charities, many of whom will be working in international context, but perhaps it's a bit lateral. But I spend all of my time working on collaboration in a time of crisis. And frankly, I've been at Bond for 3 years, and I had a year before as CEO, and I had a year before the pandemic, and since then it's been a cascade of various crises in the international development world. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about Bond, just so that to give you some context, but I'm going to focus on how do we, as a parallel organisation, collaborate in order to create impact. What sort of things have we got in place? I'll share some practical examples, and then just reflect on what I've learnt, so that as you move forward, you can take that learning and hopefully not make all of the same mistakes that we did. So Bond is the membership body for all of the international development agencies in the UK. So our members are Oxfam and Save the Children, but also small organisations based in Harrogate, focused on projects in India. So a whole range of different members, different sizes, shapes and sizes. And we're very clear that our purpose is to create a more just and sustainable world through our members. So we think that through collaboration and through us supporting our members to be better organisations and to have the sort of policy environment that we need, we're going to achieve our ambitions and the ambitions of our members. So we, since I've been at Bond, we've put together a three-pronged strategy. So our first ambition is about influencing UK policy and politics so that the UK shows up in the world and it's positive for international development. Now, for any of you who have who are kind of familiar and following the journey of the international development context in the UK and the aid budget and those sorts of things, that isn't going brilliantly well for us at the moment. But I'll tell you a little bit more about sort of how we influence and what we do in a bit. The second thing is about helping the sector itself to transform and respond to the changing context. I think that all of us as organisations are experiencing increased pressures, changing demands, challenges of legitimacy. So how do we actually positively engage and work through that change? Be that being actively anti-racist as organisations, be that about making sure that the people that we work with actually get to make decisions about their own future, and it's not something that is being imposed on them, through to how do we respond to things like climate change. And then the final thing is the more standard membership body activities. We bring our members together to learn about how do you do monitoring and evaluation, how do you do the best sort of project management. We have services and make sure that organisations are supported. And right now we're doing a whole load of work about how do we respond to the cost of living crisis? What sort of pay rises is everyone giving? How do we sort of average that out and sort of benchmark? So all of those kind of very real and tangible challenges that have the risk of eating into our reserves and reducing our ability to do what we want to do, which I'm sure you're all experiencing. And finally, we want to be an inclusive, happy organisation in order to do all of that. So that's Bond. And I think that for a membership body like MCG, that kind of combination of challenging and changing the members and helping them to make progress, making sure that organisations are resilient and able to weather the changes they're experiencing, and also trying to shape the policy environment is a really sort of important combination of activities. So, this is the last bit about Bond, and my comms manager has obviously been messing about with this slide. So eventually, we'll get the whole thing. Oh, and then there you go. Hopefully you won't have to. So we have 418 members now. We had in the last year 338 media hits, and that sort of rises year on year. We have 41 working groups working from, and that ranges from, we have a media group that are constantly in touch, tracking what's happening. Right now, they are waiting to know whether James Cleverly will be our next Minister of State. And right through to kind of more practical membership bodies. We have a very active working group on disability. We have a people of colour working group, a whole range of different things. And people really engage with that. That's how members engage, and those working groups tend to be member-led, so if there's something that a member wants to bring people together around, like the Sustainable Development Goals, they can then say, anyone else interested, and then we support that group. And then there are some groups that we create because we think that there's a real need. So the sorts of things that we have done over the last few years range from advocacy on international development that I talked about. So I chair the Civil Society 7, which is, so for the uninitiated, the G7 process is very complicated, and there are a number of bodies that feed into the G7, and there is a Civil Society 7 that I chair. So I get all of the civil society members together, and then we engage with the government on what would we like to see out of the G7 process each year. And so that's the sort of thing that we're doing all of the time. So, for example, when the C7 was hosted in Cornwall, I got to meet with the then Prime Minister and discuss his approach to climate finance and vaccines and all of those things. He said, yes, it'll be fine, we've got it under control, it'll be fine. Anyway, so I think that was a high point in my policy influencing. So that's our influencing. We've also had sort of big issues as a sector. So you will all remember the Haiti scandal, safeguarding scandal involving aid workers. Following on from that, we went on a sort of we did a big emergency program of making sure that we had the right policies in place, but also more importantly, what is the culture that you need to support safeguarding? And so that's been a big piece of work, and we now we're just now taking our cultural tools that we've been working with members into the FCDO in order to kind of help build that safeguarding culture in government as well. So that's one of the kind of deep dive issues that we work on. We're also about being the strong voice for the sector, so we're there ready to comment on pretty much everything, regularly welcoming new ministers, asking them for the top 10 things that we'd like them to do, which I'm sure you do too. And then there are other things like accelerating anti-racism in the sector. So like many sectors and organisations following George Floyd's murder, a lot of people made a lot of statements, and we have been working with them to really sort of understand how do you get beyond statements and into practical action. I think you've got a session on EDI later today. We are trying to combine that that desire to have a practical approach and sort of get anti-racism done, which is not how it works really, with challenging the cultural norms and the structural things that are in place that mean that we are operating in a racist environment. And then finally, one of the things that we do, which is slightly outside international development, is about ensuring that we have space to influence and to engage with government. So we have a set of guidelines on how does engagement work with government. You know, how do you make it meaningful? How do you make sure that actually it results in action? We have been working with the Electoral Commission, trying to make sure that during electoral periods, small organisations don't need to declare their activities, and so trying to make sure that organisations can continue to campaign. And we've also been involved in things like rights to protest and lots of the kind of rights agenda too. So that's some examples of what we do. So how do we collaborate to make those things happen? Well, 5 ingredients. So the first is senior management engagement. So during COVID, we quickly realised that there was a sense, we were dealing with, all of our CEOs were dealing with something that they had never dealt with before. And so we got them together and we actually met every week for a period of weeks with our CEOs. And we've continued to do that. So now we have a monthly call with all of our CEOs. We break it down into the large organisations, the medium-sized and the small, because there are 400 members, so otherwise you don't really create a community. And that is really important in terms of setting the agenda, understanding what's important, and what's going on. I also have a rolling meeting plan, so trying to meet all of our CEOs takes me about 2 years to sort of get it done. But just staying in touch. And then the final thing is, quarterly, we meet with all of our CEOs together, and only 100 tend to sort of turn up, the 100 most engaged, and we review our strategy, we kind of talk about what's important moving forward. So that senior level engagement sets the sort of baseline for collaboration and identifies where do we need to lean in and where do we need to, where perhaps can we leave everyone to it. So the second thing is about shared advocacy and influencing, and I've got an example of that in a bit. We have a number of groups that come together that shape all of our policy positions. So whilst we try and take a leadership position, we never go to government with a set of asks that we haven't agreed with our policy and lobbying group and the policy directors from our members. So that does rely on members having some resource and them having policy people who can come together. And with some smaller organisations, that will be the CEO, and others, they'll, like Save the Children, would have a massive team of people working on policy, way bigger than us, in fact. The second thing is about transformational projects. So we have, through our futures work, done some thinking on what is it that we need to be working together on. So we agree that, and then we invest resource in helping the sector to work on that. So safeguarding is one example, anti-racism another. And another one of those projects is around futures, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then active communities. So I talked about our working groups already. They are the mainstay of how we work. They decide what to do. We have chairs of each of the working groups, or co-chairs, so it's shared. They set the agenda. We just ask them to tell us what they're going to achieve. And then the final thing is supporting organisations and making sure that we are helping organisations in times of crisis. So I talked about cost of living. COVID-19 was obviously a very sort of prime time for that. And we also do things like recruitment and training. So the first example in terms of that influencing piece is the international development strategy. So you will have pieces of policy that are really important to you. And for us, as international development agencies, the international development strategy is kind of the central organising strategy that is going to determine how government approaches international development moving forward. So how our collaboration worked on that was, first up, we put together a document which was saying, what would we like from the international development strategy? We did that in consultation with our members. We have members who are experts in the food system or the health system or human rights. So they will then put their contributions in, and we will compile that into something that is coherent. And that then sets the agenda. So that's the first piece of collaboration. We will then turn that into formal submissions and also work with the government to ensure that there is an engagement process, because that isn't automatic. The current government have sort of mixed energy for engagement. Sometimes it's good, sometimes not so much. And then we also engage with the team in FCDO, so with the officials. Then we go out again and look at, so what are the issues that are emerging from the international development strategy, and we will run sessions with our members to get more insight, bring in more expertise, build the evidence case, and again, very sort of member-led. So for us, sustainable economic development and trade was a big issue, conflict, climate, and locally led development, which is essentially self-determination, enabling communities to make their own decisions. So that kind of is all happening together with our members. So you can imagine the number of meetings that our public affairs team are organising to make that happen. We then, Bond, produced some hallmarks that said this is what is going to make the international development strategy a success, which was a sort of refined down checklist. And then we share intelligence across our membership. So we found out that there was a risk that climate change wasn't going to be in the international development strategy. So we then did some more public influencing to say how important climate change was in terms of the context of the international development strategy. That then was back into the strategy. So that's kind of a quite detailed look at a process that will be parallel to the sorts of processes that you will have and you will want to influence. The key things were that we came together to agree what did we want, and that it wasn't the longest shopping list that you could find, because that's a route to not having any success. I've been to sort of many meetings where there are 20 people sitting around the table all asking for something different, and that doesn't really work in terms of influencing policy. And then that you find the routes into influence, and some of those are inside government through your officials and channels and meeting with ministers, and some of them are more public, dependent on what's happening. So that's the international development strategy. Just quickly, I'm sort of rather regretting showing you this slide, because I'm not going to explain it. The other thing that we do for our members each year is say, what is happening in the external context? What are the big things that you need to be thinking about? And for international development strategies, it's social pressure, including from the people that we work with in Africa, Asia, Europe, a variety of countries. There's political pressure in the UK, and then there's the sort of wider global context. So a lot of issues that are essentially defining uncertainty for our members and our organisations. And from there, so we collaborate with our members, we get their insights into what are they seeing, what are the risks that they're facing, and just make sure that everyone, I mean, you couldn't not be aware of the cost of living crisis right now, but you might not have the same sort of oversight into what's happening in the World Bank and the IMF and how they're sort of slightly falling apart also. So that's that kind of is a service that we provide, but it also informs what we do. And so then we move into deep dive collaborations, which was the transformational projects that I was talking about before. So this one was again looking at, right, how does an organisation like Oxfam or WaterAid make sure that when it is working in a country that the people who they're working with get to decide what they do? Because there's lots of white elephants out there that were kind of imposed on communities, and that needs to change. So how do you actually sort of make that transition so that local decision making is at the heart of international development, and that ensures value for money, for the aid budget, but most importantly, sustainability and empowerment of communities. So how do we do that? So we identified what are the challenges, what can we do about it, and then put some working groups together to address that. So those are two examples of how we work in collaboration. In terms of what have we learnt, well, one thing I learnt was that we're 30 next year. So this is nearly 30 years of learning for Bond, but only 3 years for me. I think what works is being member-led, making sure that you allow enough time to have those conversations, because it is hard to get everyone to agree, especially when their issue is water and water isn't on the shopping list. You need to sort of lift it up to something more strategic. We find that a values-based approach works for us. So by that I mean people join Bond not necessarily because of the services we provide or the discounts that we offer on our training, but because they believe in collective action and they believe that actually we can be stronger together, and that it's a really sort of important part of being part of the international development sector. I think what works is stepping ahead a little bit and pushing and taking leadership positions on key issues, not going too far. But so the contrary of what doesn't work is if you consult and get everyone to agree, you just end up with a lowest common denominator, which doesn't really say anything. So you have to, at some point, make a call on how bold you want to be and the sort of ask that you're going to have. We found things like rapid responses on key issues like cost of living, like COVID, really work. And that is about getting a team together quickly and then talking to your members and finding out what are the issues for them. For international agencies, foreign exchange is a massive issue right now, as well as inflation and reduced income. Regular engagement listening, it's all about relationships. Just staying in touch with people is important for influencing, but it's also important for that collaboration across the sector. And we have really benefited from a strong media and policy team, so people who are able to quickly process and bring things together. What we found is less successful is sort of transactional membership, so just purely working on the basis of services, although that is important. Also, we found that if we do nothing and just leave members to it, quite often that means that working groups just sort of dissolve. You know, that there's a kind of loss of energy. So you have to inject some energy and keep supporting members to do things. Talked about the shopping list and the lowest common denominator. And then my final thing is that the final thing that we have found is that it's much easier to agree on what we don't like than what we do like. So I think that's a kind of common theme. But actually, to be successful in terms of influence, you need to inspire and you need to be exciting. You need to offer sort of new thoughts, not just be saying, we don't like the way you're doing that. That doesn't work very well. And so actually getting our members to come together around something that is going towards rather than away from is a constant challenge. I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that, but we're doing a project called the Future Dialogues, which is trying to offer new ideas in terms of internationalism going forward. So that's my learning. I'm going to stop there. There's a conclusion slide, but I think it's more important to see if you have any questions.
Any questions, anybody? Tim, one here.
Hello. I just wondered if Bond put any parameters around the definition of international development, and therefore whether or not there's some relevance, some direct relevance between what you do and what people in this room are trying to do as well.
I think there are parallels because you're supporting seafarers all around the world. So that is international development in some shape or form. Actually, I'm trying to think what is our sort of definition, but it tends to, our work tends to revolve around work that is funded by ODA, by the Overseas Development Assistance Budget. However, increasingly, it's about sort of wider funding and the wider system change that we're trying to create. So I definitely think there are some overlaps. Graham.
Stephanie, thank you very much for a very interesting line-up on what Bond is doing. But the thing that really impresses me is that you can get a policy statement out of 418 groups, whereas we find it quite hard with 10. So what is the secret of your success?
Well, the first thing is building trust that you can make some decisions. So it took me quite a long time to establish that we were going to take the lead on some things, and that we had to make some decisions. I think so. That is the main thing. We then have a kind of go wide process, and then we're very clear that not everyone is going to get everything that they want. And then we have a lot of conversations with the people who didn't get what they wanted, and explain the rationale for that. So I think what we've learned over the years is that prioritization is really important, and everybody wants to sort of have impact across the sector.
Do you ever have the situation where one of your members said no?
Yeah, we have had some of our sort of more radical members quite often will say, that's not for us. And in fact, we did lose a few kind of more radical members at one point because we have to take a sort of more moderate position. I think also we do quite a lot of sign-on letters. So we've just sent a letter to the Prime Minister with 150 of our members signing on. And a lot of organisations will choose whether or not they want to sign on to that based on does it fit with their brand and the way that they want to engage. So there's also an option to keep it flexible.
The question here, I'm sorry, it's about finance. All members pay the same?
No.
No, so there is a scale.
Sliding scale, yeah.
Okay, very good. And obviously, all those who are members pay. There is no unpaid members.
We have a few reciprocal memberships. So there's a Gender in Development Action Network. But yes, generally, that's.
Thank you. That's okay.
There's one more here.
Big question, but over the last 30 years, what has been your learning about the best way of engaging with government, and particularly getting enthusiasm for the FCO and its FCDO in wanting to talk with you?
I think so. It's kind of carrot and stick. So the big success of the international development sector was around debt cancellation and a commitment to spending 0.7% of the budget on international support. That was a lot about public support, knowing that people would mobilise and sort of get out on the street, and supportive sort of stories and narratives in the public, knowing that it was vote winning is very helpful. But then at the same time, having some propositions and some tangible ideas that policymakers can adopt and shape and call their own. So I think those are the two things. We got a meeting with our now Prime Minister, as was Foreign Secretary, because we wrote a grumpy letter to the Telegraph about the international development strategy and our concerns. So sometimes that kind of risk of being called out in public is effective, but we try not to use that very much, because obviously you could only be shouty so much. So it's really about ideas, demonstrating public support, and then showing that you've got a strong constituency who will support you.
I just want to say, wow, you introduced the presentation saying that Bond want to excite and inspire. I'm completely excited and inspired by what you do, what you're trying to do, your aim. It's just fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Deborah. Yeah, so what we have done as Bond is we've taken an approach which is that leaders need to start with themselves and doing their own work. So we've engaged with 100 CEOs, actually just sort of sitting down and exploring what does it mean to be actively anti-racist? What are the things that I'm not seeing as a white woman? How is my sort of privilege playing out? So we've taken a sort of very personal approach, and we've had action learning sets of people sort of sitting down together and working that through, because we think there's plenty of activity happening around the policy side of things, and actually it's about the nature of leadership that needs to change to break down barriers. And now we're looking at we also have a language guide, so we're quite careful about the language we use. We don't use the word beneficiaries anymore, because we feel that that's sort of quite charitable and potentially disempowering, so we talk instead about the people that we work with. We also have things like we won't speak on all male panels or all white panels, those sorts of things, in order to kind of perpetuate, to ensure that there's representation. So lots of kind of little things you can do, but also the bigger ambition. So now we're looking at what does that look like in terms of our policy influencing and engagement too.
Stephanie, thank you very, very much indeed. Fascinating, and lots, I think, for the MCG to think about. So, ladies and gentlemen, Stephanie,
Thank you very much.
So I think you'll find the title of the next session is very appropriate. But how do we know that? So, with more ado, may I ask Chris Jameson to bring his team up to the platform. And Chris, over to you.
It's a rug. Danger of falling off. Do you want some water?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is session 5 about how do we know that? Maximising impact, building an effective strategy using library data and evidence. What we're basically talking about here is how do organisations actually make decisions. If we're honest, too often is it about beliefs? Is it about instincts? Is it about organisations saying, well, this is the way we've always done it, this is the way we should keep doing it? How do we actually root decisions in data and evidence? How do we gather that evidence? How do we make sure that evidence is robust? When should we not use the evidence? How do we share it? Should we actually share it? And how do we translate that evidence into actual, tangible, effective policy? I personally can't answer a single one of those questions, so it's with some relief that I can introduce the panel. Dr. Sarah Cumbers, who's Director of Evidence and Insight at Lloyd's Register Foundation. Mike Birmingham, who's Director of Research and Development at Royal Navy and Royal Marines Charity. Professor Matt Fossey on the end there, who's Director of Veterans and Families Institute at Anglia Ruskin. And Tom McBarnett. Thomas or Tom? Tom McBarnett, who's the Chief Executive of Forces in Mind Trust. So lots of case studies and expertise to come from the panel, and I'll give obviously all of them a chance to talk through those case studies. We'll take lots of questions and observations from you as we go. To start though, I just wanted to ask each of the panelists a question, and I'd just like kind of 60 seconds or so from each of you, if you can, just to get us started. And it's a fairly obvious question, but an important one, which is why is evidence actually important in terms of formulating policy and strategy? Sarah, how would you answer that in a nutshell?
I think, first of all, we have to think about what is evidence. And to me, evidence is information that either supports or undermines a particular assumption or belief that you might have. And so the important thing to do is to think about the decision that you're making and think about the information that you need to support that decision, and to make sure that you're not just going on your belief or the way it's always been done, but to really think about the data and the information that you need to either support or refute the assumption that you're making.
Brilliant, thank you. Mike?
Yeah, and taking on from what Sarah's just said, once you've got that evidence, can you use it as a common language in collaboration? Can we use that in conversations as a largely funding organisation to have with those that we're funding? So it's not only where we are at the moment, but what outcome are we hoping to see? What evidence and information are we hoping to see as a result of funding and subsequent service delivery? Also, if we are dealing with a lot of crises, as we tend to be moving from one crisis into another, is there any way we can get upstream of that? So how certain are we of the evidence? And how certain can we apply that knowledge, insight, data towards adopting a more proactive approach, early intervention or even prevention? So for all those things, evidence has to be challenged. We need to know whether we've got a complete set of evidence, how complete it is, whether the data set is trustworthy, whether we can test it. All those things are related to evidence before we move on to applying it.
I guess who does the challenging as well is an important question to follow up. That's really interesting. Thank you. Tom?
Well, Chris, I'd say that for Forces in Mind Trust, positive impact would be a UK-wide commitment to the successful and sustainable transition into civilian life of all service leavers and their families. And so one element of our strategy is to support an effective and credible knowledge and evidence base which influences and underpins effective policy making and also service delivery. And we certainly believe that by funding that credible and authoritative research and evidence base, we can really get to the heart of the issues that for us will introduce the positive change that we desire.
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's quite difficult going at the end because people obviously answered quite a lot of the questions I would have said. But I think one of the things that's really important is you're asking the right questions of your data, because sometimes when you have data, you think it's going to answer everything, and so you need to sort of approach that quite carefully, and that's really why research is difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. And I think people think that they can just go ahead, analyse something, come up with an answer. That's it. It's not always quite so clean and easy. If it was, I wouldn't have a job. I'm sure you probably wouldn't as well. So, and Tom wouldn't be funding anything. So these things are really, really important. And so it's the quality of that data, but also how you interrogate it as well. And and I think Sarah mentioned this earlier on. I mean, data means a lot of different things. It's not all about numbers necessarily. Numbers are one aspect of data. It could well be, stories and narratives of people's experiences, which are incredibly important for this particular sector. But how do you deal with that? How do you manage that? How do you work through that? How do you look at rich data? And how do you use that to also influence, as well as looking at other numbers as well? The numbers will tell us broadly what's going on. To find out, to get under the bonnet, and to really to sort of try to really understand what's going on, I think you need to understand the narratives.
Thank you. Really interesting. So, Sarah, let's hone in on you first of all. And you started by talking about what evidence is, that definition, which is important. Do you just want to expand on that a little bit?
Yes. I mean, you know, I think probably picking up on Matt, or what Matt was just saying about different forms of evidence. For me, another really important principle is best available evidence. That you may not be able to make a decision on the basis of a gold standard trial that might be used in healthcare or medicine comparing the effectiveness of two different drugs, because it's simply not possible, or you can't get it funded within your particular context to do a trial. So do you just not make the decision, or do you just use your own belief? No, you don't. You use what's the best available, and that may be a qualitative questionnaire of individuals who've had experience of the particular issue you're talking about. It may be going to the literature or just searching on Google to see what else is there. But whatever you do, whatever you find, it's really important to think about the quality of what you've found. Yeah. Because even the best clinical trials can be completely flawed if they're biased due to the funder, or if the patient population wasn't actually relevant in terms of the real-world use of that particular drug. And exactly the same will be true of the circumstances in which we're all making decisions. So you really need to think about, again, the decision that you're making and the evidence that you need, and just make sure that you're fully cognizant of the quality of the information that you have when you're making that decision.
So it's about ensuring, not seeking perfection at the expense of the good, recognizing that it's not always going to be perfect, but there is a line in the sand where actually best available actually isn't good enough.
And possibly using a mix and saying, actually, we can't get that, but maybe actually if we use this and this and this, and it triangulates and it's all telling us the same thing, that's actually telling us something really important. As important as actually if they're all saying something completely different. And then you really have to think, well, why is that? And what else could we find out to make us a bit more secure in the decision that we're going to make?
And go on, Matt.
I think we talked about collaboration was a theme that came up in the session before lunch. And I think that's equally as important in research as well. Because as academics, as researchers, we potentially have different approaches to looking at the data. So I'm a social scientist. I quite like people's narratives. I think they're really, really important and powerful. But other colleagues that I work with are more interested in big numbers and big sort of survey data and things like that. But on their own, they're not as powerful as working together. So collaboration in research is also very important as well. And as much as it may be sort of something that you may read about researchers who are also fighting with each other, and of course we have to fight with each other for research funding, which is sparse, apart from Tom, obviously. But it is a big challenge. But we do prefer to work together because you help to answer the questions better. Yeah, you work together, so that's really, really important.
Yeah, we'll definitely explore collaboration a little bit later in the hour. Sarah, then you sort of defined evidence, root it in your organisation now, in the Lloyd's Register Foundation, and talk, well, first of all, just explain, maybe in a nutshell, what the organisation does, but also how you use evidence.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of the Foundation. We're a global safety charity. Our mission is to make the world safer, and we do that through funding a whole range of programmes, innovation, education, research, of which many of our programmes focus within the maritime sector because of our links with Lloyd's Register Group, of which we're the sole shareholder. And we use evidence in many different ways. Our strategy starts with evidence, starts with the best available evidence, and ensuring that as a foundation, we've got the information that we need to make our funding decisions, to make our strategic decisions. So where is harm occurring in the world, and what do we know about what can be done to address that? So one of our flagship programmes, for example, is the World Risk Poll, which asks a series of questions about risk and safety to the global population. 145,000 interviews conducted by Gallup back in 2019, 121,000 in 2021. So we've got a programme of evidence generation there looking at risk and safety issues. So that's one of the first pillars, is about if you don't have the information you need, then you can generate it. And then we're interested in what's out there already and in using that information to answer questions about risk and safety. So what works in addressing a particular issue? So seafarer welfare is one of our priorities at the Foundation. We've done quite a lot of work with Nottingham Trent University to explore what evidence is there for what works within the maritime sector to keep our seafarers safe from a psychological perspective.
And there's an interesting, I suppose data in some ways is about correcting misconceptions that can grow, isn't it? There was a really interesting stat that's kind of kicked around the sector for ages about the extent of maritime accidents that involve human error and how you've used data to kind of confront that a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd be interested to hear actually from people in the room. How many of you are familiar with that fact that 80% of casualties, or 80% of incidents at sea result in human error? Well, we did a bit of digging. Our information specialists, I can see 3 or 4 hands popping up, probably more popping up. It's unsubstantiated. It goes back, I think, to the 1960s, but it's something that is quoted readily. It's quoted in publications. It's something that I've heard a lot of times since starting at the Foundation, but it's not actually established in fact.
Yeah, my response to that is always, we don't know how many things didn't happen because of human intervention. So it's really a dodgy piece of information on both sides.
But it's one that many people in the room are familiar with. It's it's pervasive.
It's gone unchallenged for quite a long time.
It's an absolute fake news. And if you Google it, then you will see what I'm saying.
Yeah. I'm just going to get a sort of reaction from the panel to what Sarah's been talking. Any brief follow-ups you want to make? And then perhaps if you've got a question specifically about what Sarah's said there, let's take that. But we will have room for more general questions at the end. Panellists, something you want to pick up on what Sarah's talked about there?
Well, I mean, from Forces in Mind Trust perspective, we came onto the scene in 2011 when, at a time when there wasn't a whole lot of objective evidence out there on the veteran community. There are still, and there probably were then, more than 1,800 service charities all doing their best to work for and with their beneficiaries. But in terms of influencing government policy, to be focused on the circumstances and the condition of the veteran and their family, not a great deal. It took until David Cameron to actually commission Lord Ashcroft to do his first Veterans Transition Review in 2014 to really drill down into an issue which was beginning to emerge in the public press about veterans being, to coin the phrase, mad, bad and sad. Far from the truth, but nevertheless an impression which became very pervasive and fueled a lot of initiatives to try and get beneath that. So when you're in the business of trying to address public policy, you're very much looking at the what, not so much the how, the policy, not the strategy. You're dealing with the ends of the ends, ways and means rubric, leaving the ways and means to others to perhaps, with their greater experience, to understand what will be effective. But certainly if you're looking at the policy end of the telescope and the ends bit, you've got to really understand the context, and you've also got to understand a little bit about the resource envelope too, and to circumscribe perhaps a little bit of the direction of travel. And so that very much informs an approach which is broad-based and collaborative, that understands the many factors that impinge upon human beings as they move from one area of endeavour in their lives into another, one which has been all-consuming, but which from then on they will perhaps be left on their own much more, and inevitably need some help. And so, I think that very much shapes our approach to research, Chris, and and perhaps you'll get onto the sort of collaborative projects that we've later in the conversation.
Absolutely, thank you. Any specific question for Sarah then, based on what she said there? Okay, Sarah. Front. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah and I work together, so this is perhaps a bit unfair, but
what have I forgotten to say, Tim?
No, it's not that.
Yes, please.
But we work across the Foundation, not just in gathering evidence and insight in order to make interventions, but then in communicating the interventions we're making and the evidence and insights as well. So just picking up on the point we were making as a group about false news and this perception that is then perceived as fact, what is the role of evidence and insight in sort of overcoming that societal bias or that deep-held belief that is unsubstantiated?
It's really important. It's a really good question, Tim. And I often think about actually what the pandemic has done, taking a UK focus, thinking about the prominence of the use of evidence. We're all familiar with, next slide please, from Chris Whitty, but actually something fundamental happened there, I think, in the UK in terms of actually revealing how information can be used to support decision making, and that actually we don't always have all of the answers. And so I think that has sort of changed perception there, and communication is really, really important.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's also important as well if you think about the Chris Whitty or the pandemic sort of information as well. Not only how it can be used to inform people, but how it can be used to bamboozle as well. And I think sometimes, how data is presented to people is not necessarily always presented in the clearest possible way. And, unless you sort of really understand the data or know what you're looking at, you can be led to draw false conclusions from what you see. And I think that can, whilst it can be quite dangerous in a way, because people can be led down a wrong sort of path because there's an expert standing up there saying one thing. And, and that's why in our sort of world, the things that are important are things like peer review. That I don't know if people are familiar with this, which basically mean that when we do any research, when we write stuff, there's an expectation that our peers will critique it and often rip it apart. And it can be quite upsetting, for want of a better word. But it's important because you want to get it right. I mean, you need to make sure that whatever you're saying is a good representation of that data and that information. And so if I may just come to another point, actually, which is about how you communicate that data then onto people like, when you're working with policymakers or working with government. If you're doing some research, how do you make sure that you don't sort of end up just delivering the research to them and saying, there you go, here's what we've found from analysing this data. I think it's really, really important actually you take your research commissioners or the policymakers on a journey with you as well, so that they understand how you're working with that data, they understand how you're analysing it, they can see how you're coming to your conclusions and how you're developing your recommendations that fall out of that data. So it's not a great big surprise at the 11th hour. If it's a big surprise, you're doing it all wrong. I think, in a way, that's one of maybe the problems with academia, is a lot of academics aren't particularly good at taking people on that research journey with them.
And if I can, Matt, just give a plug to one of the Foundation's programmes, the Risk Know-How Framework, which we've developed in conjunction with Sense About Science. It seeks to do exactly that. It's a framework for supporting policymakers, communicators, whoever has information that they need to share, in this instance about risk and safety, but actually these are general principles that stand true. How should that best be communicated? But also, what skills does the public need to be able to interpret that in the correct way? But also challenge it so that they can understand when the wool's being intentionally or otherwise pulled over their eyes. So do Google the Risk Know-How Framework. It's great.
Just say it again, just so people...
The Risk Know-How Framework.
Okay, we'll take 2 quick questions if we can, then I want to move on to the other case studies. Yeah. Yeah, why not? Go for it.
Hello there, Tony Wright Forward. It says, as someone who's had a grassroots military charity for 15, 16 years now, one of the key issues I found when we were going for funding was basically, where's the evidence to support what you're doing here, Tony? So there's a big gulf still, I think, between evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence, which is what we do, and we now promote it. And I think, what do you feel about how do we address that gulf? How do we get the lived experience of hidden populations and invisible veterans, although they do exist in different subgroups? How do we get that information shared with not only the academics but also the main funders and government, because there is a campaign element to that?
Yeah, it's really important. I think what I've learned since being at the Foundation is how little monitoring and evaluation happens when programmes and interventions are put in place. And I would just encourage organisations not to take a step out the front door of on your project until you know how you're going to measure the impact of what you've achieved. Because I think if you have that at the back of your mind, that actually unless we know it's been effective, that we're not going to know where the next piece of funding is going to come from, and build that into your funding applications. Make sure that actually you've got monitoring and evaluation included within the budget for that, so that when you go and apply for the next grant, you've got that information there. I think it's hugely important, and get it shared by making it available.
Thank you. I'm not going to take any more questions at this point because I want to ensure that all the panelists have a chance just to explore the case study, but there will be time to pick up on questions later on if that's okay. Tom, you started there just to explore the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre. Just in terms of the way you've used data, the way you used evidence to achieve impact, how is what the centre is achieving and has achieved, how is that different as a result of data sort of sitting at the heart of how you did things?
Well, our engagement with a research centre goes back to 2017 with a £2.5 million investment into Anglia Ruskin University, where Matt comes from. And it's been absolutely fundamental in, I think, cohering and curating in an accessible and authoritative place what we know, not everything perhaps, but pretty much what we know and what we need to know about the people that we're interested in. I mean, I think that a lot of the work which we would see as having been the most influential. I mean, I talk about our Call to Mind series of reports into the mental health of veterans in England and Wales initially, but then into Scotland also. Has been recognised in NHS England as being fundamental to them introducing a specific strand into their long-term strategy to deal with mental health care pathways for veterans. And so the former Transition Intervention Liaison Service and Complex Treatment Service has now morphed into something much broader called Operation Courage, and there is a physical healthcare pathway too. That wouldn't have happened, arguably, without the being able to go back to basics, to explain what the situation was, and to actually present a case to a service provider for them to work out how they would address the challenge. So that body of work lies within the health domain of the research centre, alongside a whole lot of others. And so I think where people can cast doubt or be circumspect about evidence and research because they think it's too circumstantial or too particular or too dependent on the particular place in which it was conducted or it was manifest, then I think it's important to be able to bring that together and in an easily interrogatable space for those who can do this work properly to pick out the real strands that are important to enable us to make progress.
Thanks. And Matt, do you want to just pick up and expand on that collaborative role that you've had?
Well, a little bit. I mean, it's also worthwhile saying as well that there's a lot of investment in research in places like the US. So I think in our sort of field, so I mainly work with the military and veterans, but their research budget is bigger than their defence budget. I mean, it's bonkers. And so they spend an inordinate amount of money on research. And we then tend to take that and try and sort of generalise it in the UK context. And that's folly, because what we're trying to do is to sort of say, well, what goes on in the States and potentially in the other Five Eyes nations, we can apply directly to the UK culture. And that's not really possible. So, it's great that we've had sort of investment in research in the UK over the last sort of about 10 years now, really, to look at these specific challenges with regard to our cohort. But I think that also extends out to the people that you look after as well.
But as Sarah said, sometimes it is about taking the existing research that's out there and repackaging it
Well, no, well, yes, it is, and no, it's not, because I mean, there's some research that you can do that with.
Some that you can't.
There's some that you can't, and half the problem is, I think, certainly from a policy context, it's quite easy for somebody to sit in Whitehall and draw down a paper and say, oh yeah, the Americans have said this must be the case, and try to apply it in the UK context. You can't do that because, you know, the culture is very different, the way that they provide healthcare and social care is very different. You know, the nature of the VA is very different in the States. So, yeah, I don't think we can necessarily repackage a lot of this research. You know, we're not, I think if you're looking at things, I suppose from like a lab-based perspective, if you're doing a science experiment, you can replicate that, whether it's done in the States or whether it's done here or whether it's done, doesn't matter where it's done, you can replicate that. When you're looking at human interactions and when you're looking at how people interact with systems, it's very, very different because it's got to be based on the sort of the national cultures and those sorts of challenges as well. But we sort of tend to take the sort of the easy route through all of this.
I'd agree with you, Matt. I think with the caveat that I'd say it gives you a starting point. That you need to, as I said at the beginning, you need to understand the evidence that you're looking at and need to understand its strengths and its weaknesses. And context is something that's very, very important. And again, we've got a foundation publication looking at the role that context plays, in this case in occupational health and safety decisions, and how important it is that you can't, as you say, just port an intervention from one place to another, but you can understand how your context is different and then think about how you might adapt that intervention within your context to make sure that it's going to be effective.
And to either Tom or Matt, can you do it on the cheap? It sounds expensive. Matt, obviously you're saying no.
Yeah, well, I'm as cheap as chips.
But let's take you're a small organisation and you want to build on some of the things that people have said.
Yeah.
How do you do it on the cheap?
Well, I mean, I think you need to sort of really think, I just said earlier on, I think you said it, Sarah, about looking at sort of routine monitoring, outcome monitoring of your I was going to say beneficiaries, but I think that's a bad word to use, isn't it? Really, on the people that you work with the people that you work with. So how do you understand them? How do you baseline? How do you sort of see them at the beginning and then work out what's going on throughout the process? How do you collect the stories from these people as well? So it's not just about numbers necessarily, although that, you know, that's really important. And some funders like numbers to sort of validate what you've done, but also just to understand, you know, where people are coming from and why it's important what you've done. You know, and over time you can gather that evidence and bring it all together, and you can start looking at thematically throughout that evidence as well to try to sort of say, well, actually, you know, we're finding this is happening across all of our the people that we work with over time, and this is how we're helping people. Can it be done on the cheap? Well, I mean, you have to invest in it, and I would suggest. I mean, and by the way, my background. I'm a sort of a bit of a late entry academic. I spent most of my life in the NHS and then in the Department of Health. So I'm a bit of a gamekeeper turned poacher in that I've sort of delivered the stuff, worked on a policy level, and now I'm researching it. And I would say that you need to think about something along the lines of 10% of the budget should really go into researching, understanding, and improving the services that you're delivering. And you can only improve stuff that you're delivering by understanding the impact it's having on the people that use your services. And you can only do that by gathering the right sorts of information about what's going on there.
25 to 30%, did you say that?
No, about 10%.
10%. Sorry.
But you can ramp it up to 25 to 30%.
Yeah, so just 10%, is that realistic in the organisations here? 10%?
It's a lot of money, but it's... But, you know, if you want to improve yourself... So I think you just need to think about, if you want to improve what you're doing, then you've got to invest in understanding what you're doing and how it's... and the impact it's having on the people that use your services.
I think it's not realistic for us, because for most of our projects we need them funded, and it's very unusual to find a funder who would fund that sort of work within a project, in my experience.
I think, can I just comment on that as a sort of an end user? One of the things that strikes me is that we don't share data and we don't share our findings in a way that translates. So whilst I absolutely get the context of different cultures, there is often the context in society. We don't talk to other members of society who are in a different position, but actually it's relatable. So we'll talk about something like family, relationship issues around separation. That doesn't just affect the maritime sector. Do we talk enough to others? Do we get involved in research of others? children and the support. I can see Claire over there. Yeah, most sectors of society have children and have to struggle with raising children around careers. Do we share that enough? Do we collaborate enough? So it's not just about collaborating as maritime charities. It's collaborating with others to solve some of the problems. And a lot of the issues are around numbers, that we don't share the data, because once we've shared the data, we've got the quantitative big picture. We then need to get down into the qualitative area by talking to our own sector and see what's different. And that's, I think, where we can reduce the cost of some of the decisions we try and make using evidence.
Tom, can I just say one thing as well, to sort of draw attention to one of the conundrums of research in charities and also in social enterprise, is that very often the research is done by organisations that are trying to make a case that obviously advantages their own fundraising. That to policymakers isn't independent and doesn't actually argue the case for shifting the goalposts and addressing issues of cause rather than symptoms. So that is a challenge which has to be addressed, and unsurprisingly, service delivery organisations with taut budgets are hardly likely to invest in research which will find that their own delivery model is at fault. So, you know, it's a difficult one, and one that has to be addressed objectively.
Just a follow-up from Matt, we'll take that question, then we'll move to Mike.
I also think there's a big difference between research and routine measurement and understanding what's going on with your the people that use your services. So, I mean, you don't have to invest a huge amount of money in, as you were sort of saying, randomised controlled trials or something that will cost you a couple of £1 million. I mean, really, you could spend a smaller amount of money that might be a sort of a one-off investment that would then last you for an awful long time, which helps you to understand all of your the beneficiary or the people that use your services that can change my language. It's good.
Don't worry, let it go. It's okay.
So I think that's really important as well. So there is two distinct things. One of them is a sort of a larger scale issue. Another is about actually how you guys are delivering your services and how you can improve the services for the people that use them. And that, you know, you can't really improve things properly unless you're gathering the right sorts of information. That you don't have to get external people in to do that. But ultimately, if you want to get funding for what you're doing, a lot of funders will say, well, actually, what are you doing? How are you improving people's lives? How are you improving, you know, what are your outcomes? And
one of the challenges for good data on measurement and effectiveness is indeed in our title for this session, which is collaboration. If we collaborate, and we should and we do, in delivering for the people we're working with, I'm getting the language now, it makes measurement of our particular individual engagement much more challenging, because casework is very rarely linear. It's ideally almonised, it's ideally collaborative, and so how do I measure my bit of that, and how do I share that with Mandy, who might have helped, or Claire, who might have helped? I agree with why we want to do it, but I do think that in the complexity of our delivery, as that's one of the themes, of ongoing complexity and ongoing collaboration, it becomes yet more difficult.
Sarah, did you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to flag a new initiative that the Foundation is going to be investing in, out for tender at the moment, which is a What Works Centre for the safety of life and property, a global centre. And one of the aims of that centre will be to bring organisations together, user organisations, who need evidence to make decisions about safety of life, safety of property, and to understand what's missing for them at the moment. And then either to collate that evidence if it exists at the moment, or to generate new evidence. But I think one of the benefits will also be to foster a sense of collaboration between the organisations that we bring together as users within particular domains, to foster that culture of sharing what we have at the moment.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Mike, let's look at your organisation in a little bit more detail. The case study you wanted to talk about is a transition support service. In a sense, I want to start at the end of the story and then retrace back to the beginning. So let's start with the end, which is what's the impact of what this service has on its users?
So what we're trying to do is stabilise a very small cohort of people that leave the Navy every year. They leave involuntarily. They're discharged at little or no notice. They may be medically discharged. They may have failed the compulsory drugs tests. They may have other issues. But they leave at very little notice, and they can leave after 20 years service or after 20 months service. Either way, the values that the armed forces provide in terms of social mobility, in terms of skills and experience, will all be for naught if we can't stabilise them when they leave the service. Quite often, that's measured, the MOD and the career transition piece measure it in their ability to find employment. That is often not the first problem they face. In fact, it may not be in their top 5 issues that they need to stabilise. So we aim to stabilise them. Why? Because they're the people that we know from evidence and research that in the future are likely to be in crisis, that will be in one heck of a state, in a very complex and critical needs situation. And it will take some inordinate amount of casework of various organisations to unravel that Gordian knot that they find themselves now in. If we can get upstream of that, and as Mandela said, stop them falling in the river in the first place rather than fishing them out, then we can not only save in terms of future costs within the sector trying to assist people, but also maintain their quality of life, maintain the social value that the armed forces have given them, and allow them that social mobility that the service has invested in them and which they have proved their potential for. They may have made one mistake, and this is something which is quite controversial if you're in uniform, but these days drugs are quite endemic in the younger generation, almost as endemic as alcohol was 40 or 50 years ago. What we mustn't do is their one mistake affect their whole life chances and choices. So we set up a small support team consisting of social care practitioners, and what we try and do is advocate before they leave the service, as soon as they're notified, on what they need in order to transition successfully. And that may just be stabilising them. We often just stabilise them and then pass them on to other organisations who will then take them on the journey to successful civil society life.
And thank you. And what's interesting about that is that, as you mentioned, there's a kind of simple base way of measuring it. What percentage are employment? What percentage was it 3 years ago? Therefore, is it successful or not? But actually, as you're saying, it's far more nuanced than that. And actually, this is about quantitative. And to what extent does that become more difficult to measure and to demonstrate and to prove and all the things you might have to do? Not because you've got a number, but because you've got someone's story.
Yeah. So this was one of those situations where we didn't know what we didn't know. We decided from the outset that we would set up a comprehensive case recording system. I have a very good friend who sat in this room, Paul Gaffney from Defence Medical Welfare Services, who was using a case recording system for his team. I managed to talk to him. He collaborated and trusted us to be able to use a segment of that system. So there was no development costs, very small development costs. We segmented his database. We then started using it. We trained our team up in it, and therefore we're case recording everything that we do. And we're probably having 5 or 6 times as many contacts with our individuals, recording every one. The purpose for that is I'm going to find out what I don't know. And at some point in the future, I'll be able to use that evidence then to upscale it, where we may go slightly further downstream. People that have transitioned, it's not going well, they're not yet in crisis, but we can help them. What we're finding as we help our service users, as we're calling them now, but we think of them as beneficiaries, but they're service users. What we're finding helping this cohort, and it is only a small cohort, will be able to be expanded up to all those that transition. And it should be sustainable because we'll know exactly where we need and when we need to intervene.
We'll take questions from the floor in a minute, but Matt, do you want to just briefly expand on that quantitative theme that we're developing.
If I may, a little bit. I mean, certainly around the sort of the issue of early service leavers, so people that leave before 4 years or sort of disciplinary discharges. I mean, up until around about 7 or 8 years ago, people were basically booted out and told, make sure the door doesn't hit your backside on the way out. And after a relatively small piece of research that was undertaken in Catterick at the Infantry Training Centre, we sort of saw the needs of that particular population or subpopulation of service leavers, and were able to use that evidence to persuade the Ministry of Defence to actually then ensure that people that were leaving the service, irrespective of the reason for discharge, had at least some form of support. However, to go back to your point about nuancing, it wasn't, finding somebody employment is not necessarily the key thing that people need, at this sort of stage in their lives. And it's only been relatively recently, within the last sort of year or so, that the Ministry of Defence are now, within policy, are talking about looking at the well-being of people in transition. So this is through the JSP 100. However, how that actually translates into practice and how they measure it and how they understand the well-being of people, so that it's more sort of objective rather than a subjective measure of, oh, he's doing all right or he's not doing quite so well, is important. And I think, certainly within the Royal Navy, Royal Marines sort of sector, they're beginning to crack this one, because it's very, very important to offer or look at this through the sort of a social lens to sort of say, what do people need and how do we provide them with the right sorts of interventions, instead of taking a cookie cutter approach to this and sort of saying, well, one size fits all for everybody. And unfortunately, that's sort of what we've done. And if I may make a push for certainly, I think some of the things that colleagues at the back of Salute, her colleagues have been talking about this morning, around looking at women in the military as well, and making sure that we don't think about this from a cookie cutter perspective, that if it works for the blokes, it will work for women as well. And I think certainly in the maritime industry, this is very, very important, particularly when you're working in sort of hyper-masculine environments. We really need to think about, how do we make sure that we meet the EDI requirements as employers. So, I mean, we need to think about the evidence that underpins this as well, so we're getting it right, as opposed to saying, well, if it's all right for them, it'd be all right for them. That's not the case.
Yeah, and obviously far more on EDI on that session, which I think is here just before you close. Okay, let's take some questions. Yeah. Yeah.
This is 67.
Yeah, oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah? Okay, so I would like us to circle back to, I was holding my hand, but you didn't see me. Sarah, thank you very much for making a few very, very good points here, and especially context and understanding and maybe figures. So I would like to share with you two examples where I think the interface between charity world and shipping industry is on a collision course. So for charity world, the worst is better. You want to prove that you've got a case, like Tom is saying. So I'll give you an example. There was a Yale report, not that one which we'll be talking about this afternoon, but 5 years ago. Raphael reported that 26% of seafarers are very likely to have a suicidal thoughts. And the whole world went, whoa! Okay, what about male population in the world? How many of male population percentage would have a suicidal thoughts? 56%. So could Raphael, when I was critically revising his work, could he said that actually 74% of seafarers would not have a suicidal thoughts? Would you accept that in our world? Or would you rather have 26% would have it? So that's the context. Now I'll go to COVID. An intermanager organization I'm heading was running statistics on overdue seafarers. And usually, for your information, 4% of seafarers are overdue with their contract. They should go home, but they didn't. 4% on regular day. July 2021, we had 67%. So you had headlines saying, seafarers imprisoned at sea. Now, seafarers were reading that and saying, you know what, leave us alone, because we are working and we are earning money. Pilots are not. Hospitals are not. Hotels are not. So leave us alone. We are okay with being imprisoned because we are earning. But then imagine another statistics. If 67% are in prison, 67% are not at sea, are at home, and unfortunately with shipping as it is, that means they are not earning money. So there was a huge population of people sitting at home and thinking, when will I go and work and earn money? So here are two examples where I'm trying in this conference actually to ask you to reflect how you can actually manipulate data, put it out of context, give it to journalists who love words like crisis, cataclysm, whatever, because it sells, doesn't it? And we are working in a charity environment which actually without those words we would struggle a bit, wouldn't we? I'm trying to be controversial, that's my name.
Thank you. It's a famous story of Peter, I think it's Peter Scudamore, who used to run the Premier League for a long time, and he gave an interview to the Daily Mirror and he said, we have three priorities. Our priority is priority is the club, priority is the owners, priority is the fans. And the Daily Mirror headline, bottom priority is fans. So that's the Premier League owner. So yeah, I think the media can take a little bit of responsibility sometimes. Yeah.
Yes, Alex Ander-Campbell, QBSR. Really following on from that question, I've been in this sector for 19 years. So I want to take those of you who have been around a similar time back roughly 15 years. And I'm really surprised to be here because we were all presented with data that said there would be no need in the maritime sector for seafarers by 2020. I'm correct, that's what we were told. And I think the moral there is, as the professor said, we need to be careful about the quality of the evidence that we're presenting. We also need to be careful when we commission that research that we don't. I think for me, the problem going back 15 years, it was such a wide question that was asked. The answers we got were really so questionable. But as a sector, please tell me if I'm wrong, we were led to believe that by 2020 there would be, in very rough general terms, no need because the maritime seafarer would no longer be needing welfare services. So be careful about the quality of the evidence that we accept.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I make a comment to what the gentleman at the front was saying?
Just before you do that, Matt, I'll say just to all the panellists, I'm going to give you each just a minute at the end just to sum up or give a final point in the few minutes we have. So I'll just flag that up to have a think about it while Matt fills for time and gives you a chance to think.
Okay. No, I was just going to say that I completely concur with what you've said in terms of how the media use data, spuriously or otherwise, to get a good story. And, you know, it happens all of the time. They will, I mean, we did some stuff, I think, for you guys that was looking at drugs discharges from the military, and it was picked up in The Sun a couple of weeks ago. And the Sun headline from our research was that, you know, the research says that cocaine is the most, you know, the abundant drug used in the military. And I was thinking, did we actually look at that as a part of the research? No, we didn't. We were looking at the experiences of people that had, you know, transitioned out of the military as a result of failing their a mandatory drugs test. It just so happened that out of the, you know, dozen or so, 15, I think, people that we'd spoken to get this data, a good percentage of them had used cocaine. But all of a sudden, the Sun sort of headline was, cocaine is the most, you know, widely used drug in the military. Well, you know, we didn't say that. They've just interpreted or misinterpreted what was written in the data to come up with that ludicrous sort of strap, which is madness. And I think, you know, the trouble is that, you know, when this hits the headline, the front pages of the Daily Mirror and the Mail, and you know, Johnny Mercer sees it, or I'm not quite sure who the maritime minister is at the moment, but whoever it is picks it up. You know, they have a bit of a knee jerk and they go, oh my God, we've got to do something about this, without necessarily looking at the context and what sits underneath it. And I'm afraid there's too many sort of special advisors that whisper in people's ears, not necessarily based around evidence like the good old civil service used to be, that help to sort of influence and sway that. So this is where sort of newspapers, unfortunately, have quite a lot of influence in this world. So yeah, always look under the headlines.
Yeah, there are good journalists out there, though.
Okay.
Long
sorry,
as-
you're
As long as you give them a good story.
Don't dislike journalists so much.
There are good journalists out there. Okay, Matt, thanks. So I'm going to get Mike, Tom and Sarah's final thoughts. Tom, do you want to start?
Yeah, Chris, thanks. I would say, knowledge and evidence is important. It's at the base of the pyramid, really. But so is influencing and convening, so is collaborating and leadership, so is capacity building. When we think about the challenges facing this audience, I think the welfare of seafarers and the welfare, for example, of veterans is an absolutely apolitical issue. You can't put a cigarette paper between the policy positions or any political party. But what isn't apolitical is the amount of money they're prepared to put towards it and to actually stop people who have got a contribution to make to this country falling by the wayside and actually becoming the victims of poor housing policy, poor health policy, and so on and so on. So I think if we strive for the right knowledge and evidence base as the starting point, but we leverage the impact of that knowledge in all sorts of other ways.
Thank you. Mike?
I would like to leave you all with just two thoughts. Number one is always question the evidence, even if it's coming from a good place. I'll give you a quick example of that. The first 6-month pull of data I did on our transition support, I couldn't believe that 30% of our service users were female. I presume that was because they were in a worse position, they were being discharged. Actually, you look below the evidence, and there's a good deal. We are now researching it in more detail, but there's a good half of those numbers because that gender category generally has a lower help-seeking threshold. They're not afraid to ask for help, which is why they come forward when there's a service they're offering help. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're in a worse position. And we're talking to other charities, RF Bentham for one example, who's also got similar data. They're now looking into their data to see, going back to do some qualitative stuff, going back to service users, to ask them the same questions. Why did you come forward? And it's not because of the level of criticality of their need. It's because help was being offered and they took it. So you've always got to question the data. The final thing I would say is data sharing, collaboration. It's the one part, if I was going to say anything at the end of today, that we've got to get on. We can always collaborate, but we're often scared of sharing data. We put obstacles in the way like GDPR or confidentiality. Those things are quite easy to get around if you work a little bit harder on them rather than just putting them as obstacles. We've got to share more because it costs a lot to bring professors onto the stand. But it does cost a lot to get that data. I know. It does cost a lot to do involved research when in actual fact the evidence is probably out there in your service users. You just need to bring them and get them involved.
Thank you, Mike. Finally, Sarah.
3 key points from me. Think about the quality of the evidence that you're using. Know what you've got and what you haven't got, and think about then the impact that evidence has on the decision that you're making. Monitor and evaluate. Create your own evidence for you and for everybody else and share it. And then finally, if you want to get better at picking up on the phony stories in the press, look at the risk know-how framework because it will be useful for you personally as a user yourself in life, but also organisationally if you're then sharing information with others. So do Google the risk know-how framework.
Our time is up. Please thank me. And, you had your 60 seconds before, but yeah, you can have.
Okay. I was just going to say my sort of one giveaway is I think from the Maritime Charities Group, maybe one of the things, unless you're doing it already, you could be doing, is having some form of collaboration and research subgroup where you're actually looking at this across the 10 charities that are part of the organisation to actually say, how are we tackling this? How are we looking at collaboration? How are we looking at the data that we have?
Brilliant.
Thank you. Sorry for slagging off.
No, at all, not at all. Our time is up. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.